Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Katsiaficas, and I'm a policy analyst at the International Center for Migration Policy Development, or ICMPD, which is one of the 12 partners in the Transnational Figurations of Displacement, or TRAFIG project, which we'll hear more about later on. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's conversation, Ties That Bind, Opportunities and Pitfalls of Migrants' International Networks. This is the latest in the Zooming In on Migration and Asylum webinar series, which is co-hosted by TRAFIG alongside the ADMIGOV, MAGIC, and MIGNEX projects, which are all EU-funded Horizon 2020 research and innovation projects. A few housekeeping notes before we get started today. First, we invite you to submit your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function. And these questions will be addressed either in writing or during the discussion round. Second, a recording of the webinar will be made available on the TRAFIG YouTube channel for those who wish to view it later on. Now on to today's topic. Migrants are embedded in family networks as well as other personal and professional connections, and they also form new networks during and after migration and displacement. In some cases, migration and displacement have led to the emergence of diasporas that are scattered across the world, and many migrants and refugees remain connected to family members, kin networks, and others in their country of origin and in destination countries, as well as countries of transit or first asylum. And taking a transnational view then can provide important insights into the linkages between migrants, refugees, diaspora groups, and those who stayed, among others. So we'll be discussing today the role that these international networks are playing and can play in addressing contemporary global challenges. The issues that we'll be discussing today include crises, protracted displacement, the circularity of talent and skills, and integration and inclusion in receiving communities. So we have a great lineup of speakers doing interesting work on these topics, so let's get started. I'll begin by asking each of our speakers to introduce their work as it relates to our topic today and to explain the connection between migrants' international networks and the challenges we're discussing. So what role are these networks currently playing and what potential is there for further engagement? Our first speaker is Bashair Ahmed, who is CEO of Shabaka and Research Associate at the University of Sussex. She has many years of experience in research, advocacy, and program management, and has worked with several UN and international organizations, including Human Rights Watch, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and the United Nations Office for Humanitarian Affairs. Bashair has a PhD in Migration Studies from the University of Sussex. So Bashair, could you start us off by please saying a few words about Shabaka and sharing your perspective on the role of diaspora engagement in times of crisis?
Yes, hi, good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you. This is for this opportunity to discuss this quite a timely topic when we're talking about transnational migration and that kind of network engagements. Shabaka is a diaspora-led and focused organization looking at this specifically diaspora engagement in humanitarian action, so preparedness, response, and recovery. One of the reasons was there was a massive gap in terms of how diaspora engage. Most of the focus and most research, academic and such, has focused on the development role, but not so much how diaspora engage in terms of crises in origin settlement countries. And we've seen this with in terms of the COVID response. This kind of brings me to a very interesting research that we've done with the European Union Global Diaspora Facility. So it's great to see Fanny here as well too. With that, where and I can just share a few slides, or it can be shared later after the lecture, which just to kind of highlight some of the findings in terms of this particular area. Is it okay to share the slide again? Great, thank you. Essentially, in terms of the research, we looked at several countries. So we looked at Lebanon, Nepal, Nicaragua, Sudan, Ukraine, and Zambia. And this was quite important because we had to look at different contexts. Diasporas are very diverse, very different, and the needs and migration histories kind of plays into that. So you have to look at networks, practices, and challenges to understand better how to enhance diaspora's impact, because they're already doing this work in terms of responding to crises. And in the report, it highlights the diversity of these responses. What we've seen is kind of the fluidity and the speed is much quicker than kind of the institutional humanitarian actors. They have different roles and resources, and it's more about pragmatism in terms of like getting the needs to a place, and also about connectivity and trust. And you see this in so many examples is, you go in, who is this person coming in? Is it new? But once the networks, they trust you. There's a lot more sharing, kind of more openness about the specific needs and all of that. And also that kind of like respect. It's not kind of like, we're just going to send something to you and you're going to accept it because that's what you need. But is this kind of like collaborative kind of discussion? Another thing is, there's many layers, and I don't want to kind of go on into that. There's a lot of opportunities where you can have institutional humanitarian actors and diasporas and such can have more impact, especially as humanitarian needs globally, especially during the current pandemic, have increased significantly. And you have seen funding cuts across the board. So how do you do it with less resources when you need to assist even more people? So then that needs to be done together. So, localizing impact, working together as networks, sharing resources. However, what we continue to see is diasporas and the humanitarian institutional actors are not speaking really the same language. There's a lack of dialogue and coordination and lack of trust on both sides as well. Institutional humanitarian actors like, these, diasporas don't know the humanitarian architecture, humanitarian principles and such. So everything has been done to kind of like, let's get diaspora to emulate what we do because we do it best. However, is this really the way to go ahead? So we have to kind of look into that. And also migrants and diasporas have their own protection needs. So just understanding that, and again, that comes back to the point of trust. In terms of the all of this, and I'll just kind of hold the fort with that, is more of a call, which is let's look at engaging diasporas, not just in humanitarian or just development, but look at this as a continuous field. Have diaspora policies that expands this particular engagement, so in origin countries and also settlement countries. Don't just focus on remittances, but more broadly, and also look into generationally. And I think another layer of it is ensuring, facilitate regular migration pathways to reduce vulnerabilities and ensuring protection. I think this is kind of like the main points, but of course, more than happy to discuss further. Thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing.
Great, thank you. You raised several important points, including the importance of pragmatism, connectivity, trust, and looking really broadly at diaspora engagement. I'm sure we'll be picking up on these themes as we continue our conversation today. So thank you. Of course, of the crises that lead to displacement, this displacement in many cases becomes protracted, which brings me to our next speaker. We'll now hear from Benjamin Etzold, who is a senior researcher at the Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies, which is coordinating the TRAFIG project. He works on patterns and trajectories of migration and displacement and studies people's vulnerabilities, livelihoods, labor relations, and mobilities in different regions. Benjamin has a PhD in geography from the University of Bonn. So Benjamin, could you please tell us about the aim of the TRAFIG project and what this research tells us about international networks and solutions for protracted displacement?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Caitlin, and thanks for the invitation to this very beautiful round here. Just following up on Bashair, sort of one of the crises, as Caitlin already mentioned, is can continue, right? And displacement is not a temporary phenomenon, but the experience of displacement can go on and on and on for many people and for many, many years. And these so-called sort of long-lasting situations of displacement where displaced people often find themselves under very precarious economic conditions, they're often in legal limbo situations where their rights are severely restricted, and they're often socially marginalized by the population where they are living. And this is all after their initial displacement, and as I said, this can continue for years and years. So our consortium, the TRAFIG consortium, we are an EU-funded project. We're now in the last months of our three and a bit year project with 12 partners, and have done research on protracted displacement in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe. And And I think one first key insight of what has been actually the starting point of our whole discussion is sort of that we need a paradigm shift in how solution towards these protracted displacement situations, how they can be sought and which alternatives can be proposed. And if you allow me, I will quickly just share my screen to illustrate what I also mean with an alternative approach. So conventional thinking on displacement, hang on a second, normally starts, either like from the countries of origin, sort of with tackling like the root causes why people have been displaced. Normally then also humanitarian organizations, governments, and all of that look at the destinations, and of course how displaced people can be best supported at the place where they have found refuge. And of course, many organizations, many researchers, they also look at the pathways, at the trajectories, how people have been displaced, the moves they have made, also the role of circular mobility in the context of displacement, also the long journeys that people take. But what I think is quite rare, and what we try to do in our project, is to look at the social networks of forcibly displaced people at different scales, at the local place where they're living, at translocally, sort of within the countries where they have found protection, and in particular also transnationally. Just sort of this map displays some of the survey answers that we've asked to 1,900 displaced people who have been interviewed in the Congo, in Ethiopia, Jordan, Pakistan, Greece, and Italy. And it shows the transnational networks of Eritreans, of Congolese, of Afghan and Syrian refugees, and in gray, those from Western Africa. And just without going into details, just this image just already shows the very complex picture of displacement, and that a lot of people truly are widely embedded in transnational networks, and that we cannot ignore the particular social constellations, not only which have led to displacement, but the social constellations in which people find themselves, and that we must see these social constellations, the networks in which people are embedded, also begin to see them as part of the solution to the problem that we are addressing. We can just stop sharing here and continue with my next point. So, what kind of networks are we talking about? It's networks can mean everything. Sort of, we particularly looked at the role of the family, of neighborhoods, of ethnic communities, of intergroup relations with more so-called host communities at the place where people live, work-related networks, but also the contacts to humanitarian organizations, to the state, and also churches or religious communities be a fundamental aspect of the social embeddedness of displaced people. And of course, diasporas, so the wider, the global webs of relations that are based on a common identity and shared background are a vital part of the networks that people draw upon as well. We saw in our research, for instance, in the Congo or in Jordan, also that of course that the global extent of networks or the spatial extent of networks varies substantially. In the DRC, we particularly looked at internal displacement, and of course we're not surprised to see that their sort of the global reach of the networks was not so big. And this is certainly something different than when you ask Afghan refugees in Pakistan or Syrian refugees in Jordan, or many were part of the world refugees we spoke to in Italy or Greece. So it's clear that sort of with the longer people move, so the scale of the networks, of course, extend as well. But we also saw that in many contexts, transnational networks did not play a big role. We saw that, for instance, sort of people might have a relative brother, a cousin or so living in another country, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this person can also support you. So it's not only the existence and the spatial extent of networks that we need to look at, but the quality of network relations, sort of whether these network relations hold. And we need to look, for instance, how families maintain relations across a distance, what techniques and infrastructure is also required to do that. That we also must not forget that this, of course, always requires resources. And we also had many cases sort of where people became particularly vulnerable, sort of when they were relying on transnational networks for everyday livelihood support. But then when these transnational resources, when they waned, when they stopped supporting, people were in even a more vulnerable position than they were before. So, of course, there's much more to say about our findings, but just as the first key message from me here, these networks, they certainly matter in the lives of people, but it's not a guarantee that being embedded in a network, whether this is locally or within a country or transnationally, actually always helps you to move out of your situation towards a more secure future.
Great. Thank you, Benjamin, for introducing us to this research exploring how social networks of forcibly displaced people, including those based on families, neighborhoods, and ethnic communities, can provide important support. But while they're part of the solution, they might not be the entire solution. We'll get back to that a bit later when we discuss the challenges. So shifting gears a bit now, we'll turn to my colleague, Fanny Tittel-Mosser from the EU Global Diaspora Facility. Fanny is Knowledge Management and Research Officer with the EU Global Diaspora Facility at ICMPD Brussels. She completed her PhD in 2018 on the topic of mobility partnerships and migrants' rights, focusing on the MENA region and West Africa. Fanny previously worked on various migration-related projects with the UN, ICMPD, the private sector, and NGOs, covering topics related to diaspora engagement and legal migration, among others. So the EU Global Diaspora Facility recently released a report exploring the role that diasporas could play in the implementation of the EU's talent partnerships. Fanny, could you please share what the EU Global Diaspora Facility does and share the findings coming out of your work on the ways that diasporas can support the mobility and circularity of skills and talent? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. Good afternoon. Very happy to be here with you today. So the EU Global Diaspora Facility is the first global project on diaspora engagement that is funded by the European Commission. And we strive to bridge existing gaps between policy development and research, and to test concrete modes of engagement, and to create a laboratory of innovative ideas and policies that are based on needs and priorities that are emerging from the project, from our activities. Today the report on diaspora humanitarian response that is presented by Shabaka, but also the one that I will be presenting today on talent partnership are some examples of the type of research that we conduct, but we do also more broader research on diaspora engagement in general. So maybe just let me give you a few words of context on why we decided to look at diaspora and talent partnerships. And a year and a half ago, the European Commission presented the new Pact for Migration and Asylum, including several proposals to reshape some key aspects of the cooperation between the EU, member states, and the third countries on migration issues. And this new pact builds on the progress that have already been made by the migration partnership framework in terms of labor migration. And it also underlines the EU's need to attract skills and talents. So the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the need of the EU to attract migrant workers and talents. And so the talent partnerships were imagined as a new instrument to match labor and skills needs between the EU and third countries that are in line with previous tools such as the mobility partnership and mobility partnerships, and also more recent pilot projects on legal migration that have been implemented. So one of the key novelty of the talent partnership was really that it clearly identified diaspora as key stakeholders to include in the design and implementation of the instrument. And this is when EUDIF decided to join forces with another project that is carried out by ICMPD, the Migration Partnership Facility. We wanted to look ahead and to propose some entry points for the engagement of the diaspora in the implementation of talent partnership. And in order to conduct this study, we have also worked in partnership with ECDPM. So maybe I will just briefly highlight 3 key findings. And the first one is something that Bashair already mentioned, is really to underline that the diaspora is very diverse. And it is composed of individuals, so that can be entrepreneurs, that can be investors, that can be students, for example, but there are also diaspora organizations and networks such as business and professional networks, a large variety of other diaspora organizations of all sizes and focus, like cultural organizations, religious, sport organizations that can work at local level and national level, but also at regional level. So there are also diaspora networks that focus, for example, on all of Africa or on many countries in Latin America. So it's very diverse. And all these different types of segments of diaspora, they all have also their own interests, but also their own capacities that can range from informal activities or informal networks, like links with their families, for example, to more formalized and professionalized activities, like these regional diaspora engagement networks that are like more professional. What is also important is that all actors are part of a network, and this belonging can also be overlapping. So if we take, for example, a diaspora entrepreneur, he has his own personal network with his families and friends in his countries of origin and destination. He is also part of a business network in the country of destination. Maybe he's also part of a business network in his country of origin, or he wishes to build one there. He can also, in parallel, be part of a cultural organization or an alumni network, which also makes him part of these particular networks. So this diversity and interconnection needs to be taken into account when talent partnerships are being designed, and when we are looking at concrete ways of engaging the diaspora. The second key finding is that for talent partnerships to mobilize talents in a scalable manner, which is the idea behind talent partnership, it's really to scale up the pilot projects that are already existing. They will likely need to build on already existing diaspora networks rather than creating new ones, because it takes a lot of time to create new networks, and also because there are so many that are already existing. So we looked at how the diaspora already engages when it comes to supporting labor migration, and we found 5 key different roles, different ways that they are already working on these topics outside of their potential for the talent partnership. So they can work as entrepreneurs and employment creators in countries of destination. Diaspora businesses, they can also facilitate trade between their countries of origin and destination. They can explore investment opportunities in their countries of origin. Diaspora organizations and network can also create opportunities for migrants through their role in brokering information and building these bridges between migrants and their host communities, which is really at the core of diaspora engagement. Then, for example, when they're working with international organizations, the diaspora can also promote the transfer of skills and knowledge in their countries of origin. through more formalized engagement with the government, such as like secondment programs, or like it can also be much more informal engagement of skills transfer schemes that are organized by diaspora organizations themselves, or just someone that decides to go to their country of origin to support something very localized, very local in their own communities. So it's again very varied. And finally, the diaspora equally plays an important role in facilitating the integration of new migrants in host community. So we can also see that these roles can be can appear at different stages of the process. And then my last and the third key finding is that the diaspora is willing to contribute to talent partnerships through existing activities, but they are not that keen to be asked to take on more work as than what they're already doing. As their capacities are often already overstretched, and most of it is being done on a voluntary basis. So through our interviews, we saw that diaspora representative found that diaspora organization and their different networks, and also the different individuals, can play specific roles in the talent partnership, which are identifying talents in countries of origin, welcoming talents in destination countries, as I already said, maybe by helping them with administrative formalities and so on, facilitating employment opportunities for talent partnership through alumni network, or hiring fellow national for the ones that have companies in Europe, for example. They can also work on upskilling talent through various professional and skills development programs in countries of origin and destination, promote investment, things that I have already mentioned, like supporting the circularity of skills, and then also being engaged in policy processes, especially in the design of policy processes and the design of talent partnerships. So this is something that I will also come back maybe a bit later. So here we can see that there's a lot of potential, but there are also pitfalls to be aware of. And I think I will stop now, and I will continue on elaborating on those a bit later on.
Great. Thank you, Fanny, for these important considerations for engaging the diaspora and the many different roles they can play. As you note, COVID-19 has exacerbated the need for EU to attract talent. So I'm sure this conversation will not end today, but will become perhaps more and more important in this context. You also note that the diaspora can play an important role in facilitating integration, and this brings me perfectly to our next speaker. Anila Noor is founder and managing director of New Women Connectors, a steering board member of the Global Refugee-Led Network, and a fellow at the Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies. She has diverse experience working with national and international nonprofit organizations and causes, namely dealing with peacebuilding efforts, refugee integration, and education, with a special focus on women's rights. Anila has master's degrees in development studies, gender and women's studies, and Punjabi literature. Anila, could you please tell us more about New Women Connectors and the Global Refugee-Led Network, and share your views on the role that refugees networks can play in fostering inclusion and political participation? Thank you.
Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me. And I really appreciate all the panelists, which they shared about the importance why we as a refugee has to be involved. And this is the reason the work which we are doing, being a refugee representative or leader, we felt as a refugee, everyone is talking about refugee without refugee. So that's the main reason we as a refugee living, using our lived experience as a knowledge, and we are trying to involve in this discussion to not only to influence, but to change, because there is a so far systematic barrier, which is just talking about refugee at distance. And we are trying to give a face of this refugee discussion. They are human beings, they are women, they are children, and they are actually humans who are getting bad impact and effect of this policy instead of getting benefit from these policies. So at New Women Connectors, but before that, I will share about Global Refugee-Led Network, because as I was heading to all panelists, this is the importance we are trying to bridge that gap. Being a refugee-led network, that's what we are using. We are a part of 6 regional chapters, MENA region, Asia Pacific, Europe, Africa, Latin, and North America. And these all are actually network who are not only using their transnational capacities and talent, but also trying to showcase the similarities, regardless if you are living in Kampala or in Afghanistan or in Netherlands or in Greece or in Latin American camp. The difficulties asylum seekers are facing are quite similar. So why don't we try to address this gap? We are using our lived experience, and we are indicating the gaps in the policies by raising our voice, by advocating for the be part of the seat of on the discussion table, and how we are trying to say like nothing about us without us. This is our slogan which we are using, and we are pretty much partner with Global Compact of Refugees. And since 2016, when this New York declaration happened, they realized, the Global Compact of Refugee realized the importance to engage refugee representative, refugee voices there. But we as a refugee, we felt we are facing invitation-based engagement. And then we start advocating for meaningful participation. And meaningful participation is the main, you can say, a backbone, a key message of our advocacy right now, because we saw when this pandemic happened, this really magnified the inequalities in the system. The privilege with different nations, different people, different organization, different power structure has, and how this vaccination becoming like a new debate. So we as a refugee, what we did, we use our local engagement, and we start without even waiting for anyone, we start generating our own local engagement, our local expertise, and we try to advocate for the information about this pandemic and COVID. We deliver a session, we deliver online session. We have a mechanism where we translate this information voluntarily. So we really generate local response. So this is about very quickly engagement which we are doing in Global Compact of Refugees, with the global forum GRF, and even which we just finished a high level official meeting in 2021 in December. We present how there is a still gap and how we trying to create more engagement of refugees, but as a meaningful way, not only in invitation, or how we can avoid tokenization. Now I will come back to New Women Connectors. So New Women Connectors is again come up as an initiative based on my own experience. Coming from a developing country like Pakistan, we felt as a woman, you always have less opportunity to share your opinion, to share your voice. And similar experience I felt when we are talking in the policy, even EU, in European countries. Everyone wants to have improve gender equality, want to inclusion, they were talking about diversity, but being a woman from developing countries, being a brown woman, we felt these policies are gender blind. They are not talking about the feminist approach. They are not talking about our own experience as expertise, and a woman being victimized, and their narration, their narrative has such kind of stereotypical image, which is suppressing the opportunity to the woman to be feel integrated, to feel celebrated. So that's what we are doing at New Women Connectors. We are talking about the policy with the gender lens, with the resilient lens, and how we are making meaningful participation and gender inclusion and integration in the policy. So we all are migrant refugee women who are talking about the policies, because that's actually missing. When we are talking about women participation, we think we only need to talk about their children, their family, they are as a mother, but we are trying to challenge that. We say we are policymaker, we are co-partner, and we are developing, co-designing the future of Europe, which is our home. So this is overall, short kind of presentation of work, but I will really stress again, being involved in the policy debate, we as a refugee and migrant, we felt there's a huge gap of understanding. I heard one of the panelists once saying the language barrier. So it's like being involved in the refugee, how we can unpack these terms, this jargon of the policy language. Because if we are saying we are doing the consultation with migrant refugee, and if you go to a common migrant refugee and say, oh, we want to do the consultation, maybe it's difficult for them to understand. But we say, we just want to talk. We just want to listen to each other, then how we can facilitate this discussion. So this jargon has to be, tackled and unpacked, and that's what we are trying to do. Yes, thank you. And I'm happy to have further discussion and the questions.
Great. Thank you, Anila, for your remarks on lived experience as knowledge and the importance of advocating for participation for refugees and for migrant and refugee women that is meaningful. So we've talked now in this first round quite a bit about the positive role that diasporas and other existing and new international networks can play. But of course, we don't want to overlook the potential pitfalls, which have already been alluded to by several of our speakers. So we'll now take a few minutes to discuss the challenges, whether these result from dynamics within these international networks, or whether they stem from relying too heavily on these networks in general. So Anila, we'll come back to you. Based on your experience, what challenges do you see?
As I already mentioned in the challenges, is like individual challenge, barriers, and also barrier of institutionals and how we are making our laws and policies. So there are different kind of level of challenges we are facing as a refugee representative or refugee or migrant advocate. So one challenge is like how they are still taking you as a on the distance level, just they are talking about you, and there's limited resources to be involved in this discussion. As I mentioned about meaningful participation, and I always give the example of the ladder of participation. And we are refugee representative, we are still stuck on the tokenization. And we are stuck on the invitation-based involvement, engagement, even in a GRF, a Global Compact of Refugee. We always been part of discussion when they have some kind of event, some kind of a conference or some kind of a summit, and then we just invite-based invitations happening. But what we are trying to do, we are trying to engage to start from the scratch. Because if we are just meet in between and we don't know what was before and what will be happen after, the impact will be very less. And that's what we are trying to do. We are trying to engage, to share our challenges, but what actually happening if we are not addressing these challenges. The impact will be less, and it will be more wasting of time and resources, and how we are not realizing. It is same like I'm asking for a water and you are keep giving me food. It's not a rocket science. It's a very easy to understand why it is important to engage people of concern, which UNHCR mentioned, our group, people of concern. So if I use that term, we are people of concern, and we are very much concerned about this issue. And we really want to be involved in the policy to not only to change this systematic barriers, but this is the important main key to bring this solution close to the implementation of these policies. Because policy is nothing. The policies are just our words, just our different kind of rule regulation, but the implementation happens, people get to know, is it helping or not? So we are helping to create this evaluation, the impact, to unpack this talk, how to bring to the life for the people, because we really need to understand the problem of the people and how we can bring a solution by them. Not only we have bring our own knowledge, but we recognize their knowledge. That's very important.
Thank you for these important points. Well noted. Bashair, I'll turn to you. What challenges do you see based on your experience?
No, thank you. And Anila and other colleagues, you've really raised quite important points there. And again, I think it just kind of comes into the issue of how people want to work with migrant or diaspora communities, and it's very much of how we've seen with the traditional humanitarian system, which is we help you, is very much kind of analogous, like it's not as a partnership, it's very much we're going to do it for you. So I think there needs to be more of a dialogue when there's a bit more equality and equilibrium in these kind of relationships. And the other challenge is, diaspora sometimes can be distrusted and kind of seen as, as a panacea, as a risk. But I think there needs to be, closer relationships. So I think that needs to be done, coordination. There's also the danger that we kind of increasingly see there's a lot of interest of engaging with diasporas. Some for good reasons, which is to increase impact of development, humanitarian initiatives, and increase protections for those, because diaspora and migrants in final countries of destination or settlement countries and such are crucial actors in protection. For example, those migrating through Sudan from Ethiopia, Eritrea, would get support from potential family or relatives in Europe, North America, in Sudan. So you see that kind of transnational links in place. And Benjamin, I noted it's like the quality of these links. But the issue is there's a lot of people looking at, I think, the numbers in terms of remittances. Diaspora remittances is more than financial development assistance, ODA, FDA. So I think there needs to be looked at a bit more holistically, and also learn from these communities in terms of what they do. And also it's a double-edged sword in the sense that diaspora migrants, there are needs protection, but they also can provide protection. So I think recognizing these two elements, I think is quite important, rather than just kind of assume, oh, they can just help and do that. So there needs to be, the challenge for settlement countries. They need to kind of look at how can we collaborate. And I note Jeff's question there. So I'm not sure if Caitlin, if you want us to respond to questions later or now, I'm more than happy to open that. But Jeff Crisp, so no, it's a very poignant question for sure on that. Thank you.
Great. I think we'll get to the question round very shortly. And yes, there will be lots of interesting questions to discuss for sure after these interesting presentations. Great, thank you very much. So I think now I'll turn to you, Fanny, and the research, perhaps also capacity development perspective. What challenges do you see?
Yeah, so I think that, as I mentioned already a bit before, the first challenge is that policymakers, they often consider that the diaspora can do it all and without additional support. So the diaspora, they're often seen as highly motivated to work. They often work voluntarily with their countries of origin. And well, I guess this is true, but it's also unfair to try to overstretch their capacities without giving adequate financial support. So it's important not to consider that including diasporas in talent partnership scheme, they're just a cost-effective mean of scaling this kind of tools, but it should also be really a mutually beneficial endeavor where different diaspora stakeholders not only give, but also benefit from the elements within the talent partnership and also get the tools that they need to really implement this, to really be actor of this instrument. So this is an important point, I think. And related to this one, and as I also mentioned a bit before, diaspora organizations and networks, they can also be informal and they can lack experience working with development cooperation and governmental actors. And when we look at talent partnership, it's quite heavy in terms of tools. So there are EU member states involved. There are also national aid agencies and so on. So it is not it's not an easy process. So this could limit their potential role for engaging with implementing agencies and government authorities in the design of the talent partnership. So it's important on one hand to well gauge the capacity of the stakeholders to involve, but also to provide appropriate support in terms of capacity development and professionalization of these organizations and network to support whole of diaspora approach. And I think that another important challenge lays in the capacity of the countries of origin. So we can see that there is a strong appetite among the diaspora and skilled members to transfer their skills and competencies, but sometimes this can be limited by the capacity on the part of the countries of origin to receive this transfer and to actually gain impact from it. So it's important to properly frame these interventions and to build beforehand capacities of national authorities to make the most of these transfer schemes. And in one of our previous events, we had a speaker from a German Iraqi professional network that said that in their activities, they first worked a lot with the authorities to provide them with soft skills such as management skills or conflict resolution skills and so on, to make sure that then the skills that are transferred through these schemes that are more on technical topics would be well received, and they would not lead to further conflict, because the diaspora is also not always seen as the best way to support this kind of skills transfer exercises, and it can also lead to further tension. And I think that this last point is also quite important. So to not think that the diaspora is always the solution, and that well, it depends on the context. It depends on tensions that are existing, yeah. So involving the diaspora has a lot of potential, but it might not always be the solution.
Thank you for these interesting points. Benjamin, last but not least, what does TRAFIG research show as far as challenges?
Yeah, which challenges? Of course, we can address them at many levels. I think maybe first, sort of to reiterate again, I think Anila also just mentioned it. A key problem is the framing of problems, right? And the framing of particular problems is problems for states, right? So if protracted displacement situations are often not seen as a fundamental, it's not the human rights violations and the lack of access to rights and the personal security and the blocked potentials of people is not at the focus of attention, but it's a problem for states. You know, they have to care for refugees, they have costs, they have to administer them over a long time. Humanitarian organizations have to get involved, and sort of the long-term presence of refugees in a country might lead to other problems. There's the fear by Europe, sort of that protracted displacement at the fringes in neighboring countries around Europe, that it might spill over towards Europe and increasing more mobility towards Europe. So I think this is the first major challenge, is the framing of problems as such, right? Sort of we clearly played for like a really people-centered perspective, that solutions are thought for, you know, that are in the best interest of the concerned people themselves, and therefore, of course, Anila is right, and the global refugee-led network with the claim, nothing about us without us. So this is a clear claim, and this framing is a really important issue. Then when it comes to other challenges, I think in terms of reliance on networks and network structures need to be highlighted. Of course, they can, you know, talking, for instance, a displaced person being embedded in a transnational network in the sense that he or she has access to remittances from a relative abroad, and these remittances support that person, for instance, living in Jordan, to sustain the livelihoods, to pay for the rent, to pay for education, and all of this. This is all good, right? So you clearly see there's an additional source for livelihood. But of course, this doesn't mean that there's no local support, you know, that is necessary, right? It's always transnational support can also always be a complementary support. And if we also see in our findings sort of if people solely rely on transnational support, it's very brittle situations. This can, then it all depends on the quality and the stability of the relations to the network members, to family members, for instance. Of course, there's a high expectations and high pressure on people in the diaspora, in another countries or so, to remit, to send money or so. There's a high emotional pressure to support your family members, emotionally straining, at the same time sort of knowing that your family, for instance, continues to live under very precarious conditions, while you yourself, you might live comparatively comfortable in Germany or the Netherlands or so. And this continuous pressure also leaves its marks in the lives of people. You clearly see sort of that within family networks, for instance, over time, things change, positions in families change, responsibilities change, sort of the power hierarchies of families are altered, not only through displacement, but then also through the time afterwards, with people finding it easier or less easy to find a job and so forth. So and this also leads to changing orientations, and over time people might be less willing, for instance, to send money back home or to the place where other relatives live, for instance. Or in other cases, you know, the resources that used to circulate in a transnational space, they're just draining, you know, sort of they are people, and we also saw that in the context of the pandemic, you know, sort of when people have lost their job and cannot work anymore, that's of course a risk. But nonetheless, what we also saw during the pandemic, sort of there were expectations that, for instance, remittances would go down drastically due to labor migrants losing their jobs, but they didn't to that extent. But as it's in a global situation, a global crisis, sort of people always try to support whatever, but which leads also puts them in a very difficult situation. Maybe one last remark. Another risk that I see is with the engagement of networks, diaspora networks in particular, which has also been mentioned by Fanny. There's the risk that there's too much load put on these networks, and I think there's also a risk of privatization of support. Sort of, for instance, in the context of displacement or refugees movements or so. For instance, you have humanitarian admission programs, you have resettlement programs in this, and you have community sponsorship, you have private sponsorship programs, very important initiatives also that can be, as said, like a complementary pathways to bring people to protection, to support them also. But all of these programs, they sort of the key actors who are responsible to provide protection are states, in my opinion, and private and personal networks, community sponsorship can only be an additional source, and one should not solely rely on these private initiatives.
Great. Thank you, Benjamin. These challenges are all important to keep in mind as we head into our last discussion round, which is focused on what all of this means for migration policies. So after this round, we'll open up for Q&A, so please continue to add your questions in the Q&A box. So as I mentioned, in this last round, we'll be asking the speakers for their suggestions for policymakers looking to leverage the power of networks, and perhaps other considerations they should be aware of as we started talking about before when seeking to tap into these international networks. And relatedly, how can cooperation be facilitated and the process of working with networks streamlined? So Benjamin, I'll come back to you. Based on your experience, what suggestions and considerations would you propose? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. Of course, I think it must be clear, and I think it's clear for all of us, sort of that we first must recognize the potential, right, that lies in people's own networks and what networks can do. You know, people can facilitate access to livelihoods. You know, they can businesses can facilitate access to education and so forth. If sort of the network capital that people might have is brought into that. So this always at different levels, we look at different levels, sort of locally at the place where people are living. But then, of course, it's, for instance, problematic. And we saw that, for instance, with Afghan migrants in Pakistan or so, sort of if the Afghan doesn't have land titles or entitlements to own a business or so as such, that you can have business corporations between an Afghan and a Pakistani, and then sort of the Pakistani is the sole sort of formal business owner, and the other person has his skills and his investments maybe in it, but she or he doesn't have any formal rights. So there's trust is important in close networks, in close network relations. But I think first and foremost, I think it's based, everything has to be based on rights. So it's about fundamental rights in terms of legal and secure status of people, rights to education, to own business, to work, to healthcare, the right to freedom of movement and all of that. You cannot, let's say, seize the potential. I mean, it's always, I don't know, funny words, but I think sort of there's so much potential in people, but you cannot seize this potential and make use of this potential for their own good if they're constantly blocked, right? If they are constantly restricted by states in, you know, building on their own capacities and building on their own opportunities. The last point maybe is, I mean, this of course refers also to the right to mobility, I think, which is very important, right? You can only, also, I think diaspora networks can only also work, you know, if people can be mobile. It's not only takes place in a digital space, but people need to be mobile to see each other and to support each other. And in general trend, we see this right to mobility being further constrained all across the world. And I think it's a fundamental right that really must be protected and fought for. And yet it needs, I think, a basic infrastructure that sustains connectivity and that sustains mobility, of course. So, and also like, traveling infrastructure, ICT infrastructure, business infrastructure, banking infrastructures, and so forth, that are really fundamental for networks and for people to support one another.
Great, thank you. And great point that we must first recognize the potential that already exists in people's own networks. That's of course fundamental to leveraging these networks. Fanny, from your side, what considerations or suggestions would you have?
I think that the first recommendation that I would make is, again, the real need to acknowledge the super diversity of the diaspora actors and not to consider them as one homogeneous group. As I mentioned previously, the diaspora is very diverse, and this diversity must really be appreciated for the diverse set of skills and interests and the different level of capacities that this entails. So there is a real need for a targeted approach in talent partnerships to identify the skills development needs in countries of origin, but also of the diaspora itself. And it should also be taken into account that depending on the context of a country, as I just said previously, diaspora might not always be welcome and their support not always wanted. So pushing to include diaspora and talent partnerships as a streamlined approach maybe should be revised and should be more decided on a case-by-case decision, depending on the country that would enter such an agreement, to really make sure that it has an added value there. And what is also key in this super diversity of actors is that not everyone has the same interest. And while diaspora in general are driven by a desire to give back to their home countries, they also have personal interests. And these interests are as various as the diaspora itself. So, for example, when we look at a diaspora entrepreneur, he can be interested in developing his business in countries of origin. So he can facilitate employment opportunities through the talent partnership for the participants by creating jobs. So he can also develop his own business. He can also facilitate trade, for example, between the country of origin and destination, and giving access to a diaspora market in the country of destination. Here again, one of the interests is to develop his own business. So it's important to keep this win-win approach in mind for all the partners that are being involved. And countries of origin, destination, and diaspora group, they can be equal beneficiaries of the talent partnership. It doesn't have to be seen as only a one-sided instrument. So countries of origin, they can also hugely benefit from the skills transfer initiatives and partnerships that are aiming at boosting employment, while also strengthening their engagement with their own diaspora. And the EU members in EU member states, the talent partnerships, they can also present a kind of approach that is promoting legal pathways to migration that is sometimes lacking and a problem. So this is really like this win-win is an important point to keep in mind. And my second point is that it is also key to build upon existing networks and to work on scaling up successful initiatives rather than always reinventing the wheel. In the case, again, of diaspora entrepreneurship, the connection that they retain with their homeland makes diaspora particularly perceptive in terms of market needs, of employment opportunities. So strong ties between the diaspora and the country of origin, they even though they can take like very various forms, they really consist of a strong building block for the talent partnership, and they should really not be disregarded. And for talent partnerships to mobilize diaspora talent, an effective step is also to expand existing programs by engaging diaspora and working with existing diaspora networks. So, for example, there is INABEL, the Belgium Development Cooperation Agency, that has a labor mobility program in Morocco where diaspora networks, they already provide an important point of contact to reach out to African diaspora. And additionally, connecting existing labor migration schemes with other government initiatives and also the private sector, they can really open up more opportunities to scale up investment activities in both countries and of origin and destination, but also entrepreneurship. So really involving, I think, also the private sector. I mean, this is already done in the case of the pilot project, of course, but to maybe link the diaspora networks and the private sector in this regard can also open up new opportunity. And finally, I wanted to raise also the point of sustainability and the importance of engaging locally. Given that many diaspora organizations, they already carry out projects at the village or community level, it would be interesting to actually channel these resources into, for example, local enterprises or creating more partnership at local level, creating different models of engagement that can be sustainable and that can then be replicable at a bigger scale. So I think it's important to start maybe with this local level, and there are already several initiatives that are involving the local level that already exist, and these initiatives they should also be further supported. And and finally, the diaspora stakeholders that have a strong desire to be involved in the design and implementation and post-implementation phases of talent partnership. And I think that because, well, they are now shown by this research, but also by the institutions, that they can really play an important role in this regard, for it to be sustainable, and for really giving this full role to the diaspora to build upon the work that they are already doing, and then creating more structured support. I think it's very important to really involve them from the design phase, and not to come back to the diaspora once the plan is already ready. So to really have a partnership from the start to really support the long-term engagement of the diaspora.
Great. Thank you for these points, including the need to acknowledge the super diversity in the diaspora and to use this to inform targeted approaches. Well noted. Bashair, could you share also your suggestions and considerations you'd like to highlight about diaspora engagement?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you for that. And I think, Benjamin, Fanny, and Anila all raised quite important points. So in terms of, Benjamin saying, diaspora cannot, or migrants cannot be kind of like the basis for social protection, essentially. There can be an add-on. This is why, for example, the whole concept of charities and stuff exists, is not to be the government providers that are filling gaps where the governments are not able to provide these services. So we need to start looking at it this way. There's also the point that Fanny, you raised earlier, which is diasporas need to be supported. At the moment, diaspora are expected to do a lot. They're doing double shifts. That's why we have, for example, all our meetings after office hours or on weekends. So in terms of responding, so it's kind of a bit unfair in that way. So they have to be sending resources and to do this. And we've seen this with COVID in terms of the response, the kind of the pressures, because if you look at the like in the UK context, in terms of the death toll amongst those from Black and ethnic minority communities was much higher than in other communities. This is because of issues of deprivation and stuff. So there are privileged but also disadvantaged in many ways in settlement countries. So we need to look at this lens quite a bit more carefully on that. And also just kind of like issues of language and exchange, rather than this kind of concept is like, we're going to be helping you kind of concept to migrants or refugees and such. Work with them that have skills, knowledge, and all of that. So this kind of I try to avoid that language, that kind of like colonial, neo-colonial, colonial mindset is very much embedded in current structures. And this needs to be challenged systematically. So ensure you have diasporas at these points, but do not just kind of think, oh, let's just help you to do this. Work collaboratively on that. And finally, diversity on diaspora. All of us are kind of thinking about diasporas because they have these connections. We're talking specifically about the first generation, not second generation, subsequent generation. We have to start looking at this intergenerationally. What is in it for them? So you're like, oh, connect with origin countries. We've seen this in the research. So you have diasporas, second, third generation. We've seen this in Pakistan, in Sudan, in other countries. They might not have the same links as their families or parents. Remittance figures drop significantly when you get into second, third generation, but they're interested to invest. So this is where the role of business and all of that. What is going to be the takeaway from for them? So, policies at the moment are very much geared to first generation because they have these structures, connections automatically. And what we've seen with research, with the work we've done and the research is the second generation, subsequent generation are interested, but they have other forms of identities. So it could be based on religion, it could be based on ethnicity, language. So, for example, there's a program that was set up in the States. It's called Birthright Africa, where they are supporting those of African heritage or African Americans to travel to Ghana and West Africa as a way to build these connections and the volunteering. So let us be a bit more thinking longer term on diaspora engagement and not just the next 2 to 3 years, but think generationally. And I will just leave it at that, so we can have also an opportunity to hear from the floor as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Absolutely, as you noted, the diaspora doing double shifts with the increased pressure during the pandemic is definitely something that we should all be aware of. And also thank you for the prompting us to think across generations as well as we're talking about diaspora. Anila, I'll turn to you to see what suggestions and considerations you would propose for policymakers.
Yes, sure. I will add on with my panelists who mentioned how to realize and to acknowledge the diversity. The intersectional lens is very important. It's really need to be acknowledged. The intersectionality on a point of celebration, and not to compete with each other, not to like this is a refugee and migrant is important right now and this is not. Like if we see in 2016 and 17, I know everyone was talking about Syrian refugee and they've totally forgot about Afghan refugees or diaspora, and now because of recent incident everyone is now thinking about Afghan diaspora or Afghan refugee, and they are kind of not now talking about Libya or Palestine or Yemen or Syria, and now this term of like who is in a more kind of humanitarian sector to be approached with the right person to help with a humanitarian lens. So we really need to understand everyone has their own individual situation to become migrant or refugee or diaspora. We can't compete with each other. We shouldn't. This policy need to recognize. This is one second thing about when we are talking about generating knowledge and giving capacity building. It's not only migrant refugee need to understand the capacity building, is also these policymakers, this institution, these governments, these cities also need to have led by migrant and refugees initiative. Like I give you the example of meaningful participation. What we are doing from last few months, we develop a meaningful participation, and to give the understanding what we mean about this meaningful refugee participation or meaningful participation in terms of policies implementation, and how we can understand what is, and we are giving these trainings to policymakers, to the institutions, to the humanitarian organization. So they also need this capacity building for themselves too, so we can understand to each other. Otherwise I'm saying something and you are saying your language and I'm saying in my language, maybe we are saying the same thing but we are not understanding each other, and this is missing. And the most important thing about narratives, we really need to come up with a strong narrative to the new role models. We shouldn't make this victimization approach in the policies. We really need to tackle it. Why we really need to make this supremacy of we are going to save someone? No, we are saving our own selves, and we need to really need to rethink. I think being engaged in being a refugee researcher, we really trying to bring new narratives, new question and critical approach, especially in this COVID, this pandemic, really giving us a question: are we doing right things? How we can use this moment as a chance for us to rethink our approach, our analysis, our questions, even who has this knowledge to consider these are knowledges, and are your knowledge is not knowledge or my knowledge not knowledge. How we can stop doing us and them, and how we can curb whole of a society approach when we are talking about the policies. How we are not saying, okay, we are doing this because we have the power and position, but how saying we are this for us with the solidarity and with inclusive approach, with the bottom up understanding and appreciation that is really needed.
Thank you. Also for the great point that it's important to all be on the same page regarding what we mean by meaningful participation as well. Great. So with that, we'll move to the discussion round. I see we have about 15 minutes remaining, so we will try to get to as many questions as we can. And of course, some have already begun to be answered in writing. I think I'll maybe give a few questions and then give the chance to all the speakers to answer those that they wish in the interest of time. So we have a couple of related questions about definitions. So when we use transnational networks and rather than diaspora, where are the differences here? How are transnational networks, for instance, in TRAFIG defined? And how do migrant networks as a concept differ from transnational networks? If there's anyone who would like to comment on the definition of diaspora as well, I see as noted in the chat that there are several definitions, and we've discussed a bit about first, second, third generation and who might be included in this definition. But if anyone wishes to expand upon that as well. Next question, moving to some policy questions. Is the EU's new interest in diaspora engagement essentially intended to serve the purpose of reducing the number of refugees and asylum seekers arriving in Europe? And the second policy question, we have two that are a bit connected. Diasporas have engaged not only in refugee networking, but also in political issues in their country of origin. If there's any examples you might be able to give of this, but also relatedly, diaspora networks can be very political. For instance, in the case of Eritrea and Ethiopia, there are some large networks supporting regimes where refugees come from that might be seen particular ways. Could you talk about how policy networks can avoid getting trapped or what considerations they might have in working with particular organizations? If there's anyone who would like to take the first attempt at answering these questions.
Maybe I can
go ahead.
with the definition. No, if that's okay with you.
Yes, please.
Sorry. Yeah, maybe just to go back to the question on the diaspora definition, I think it's a good point to actually raise that. And my intention was not to use it as an umbrella term, but well, the definition that we are using in EUDIF. So there is not one clear definition of what diaspora is, but there is a common understanding of what it should be. And the idea is that a diaspora member is settled in one country, but has remaining ties with a country of origin or heritage to which they want to contribute. So that can be first, second, third generation, as long as this tie to the country of origin is remaining. And the question of citizenship is not. It's also not something that really comes into play, because diaspora members can have the citizenship of their countries of origin, but they can also not have this citizenship for various reasons. But for example, second and third generation don't necessarily keep the citizenship of their country of origin, and they're still part of the diaspora of this particular country. So it is still broad. It has still a lot of different segments, but it does not include IDPs, for example, or all types of migrants. It is still quite specific. I hope I answered your question in this regard. And maybe just a quick point on the question on EU's interest in diaspora engagement. And I think that Bashair will also add to that. But the first point is that I don't think that diaspora, that the interest of the EU in this topic is new. I personally already worked on diaspora engagement EU-funded project 10 years ago, so I would not say that the topic is something that is just suddenly coming up. I guess that there are up and downs in the interest, but well, I wouldn't say that it's something that is new. Then, in terms of the link between fighting refugees, the arrival of refugees and so on, there's just one point that I would like to underline is the funding of most of diaspora engagement initiatives at EU level comes from DG INPA. So it comes from now what is the development cooperation DG. So the idea is really linking diaspora engagement to development. and this is something that is like separate from other DGs that would work like on different issues. But then if you maybe look at the discourse in more, I don't know, maybe a bit more broadly. And when we look at the new pact that has been launched last year, we can see that it still is linked to the narrative on root causes. And some can argue that the idea behind this narrative is that by supporting the development in countries of origin, so through diaspora engagement or others, it would help reducing the number of migrants that are reaching Europe. So this is like, I think, something that is very, very broad. It's not, I mean, it is discussed whether it is true, whether it is not, but to say that there is a direct correlation between the support of the EU to diaspora engagement and the will to not receive refugees, I think it's a bit, personally, I think it's a bit of a stretch.
If Caitlin may, yeah, no, really interesting questions, and I would love if we had a bit more time for that. I think, so just quickly on diasporas and definitions, there's so many, the many theses, papers, articles have been written about the topic. But one thing I would say about that is very much focused on settlement countries. So that, you know, in the States, they will talk about, oh, your first, second generation based on how long you've been in the US or such. But I think we need to look at it and origin countries. Those born and raised outside origin, you know, a particular country or region, but have that connection. So I think there is a general knowledge, and it should be also a self-selecting term. So not everyone would feel strongly about being a diaspora, and it kind of changes over time. In terms of Jeff's questions, there is a lot of interest on diaspora engagement. I would say it's two things. It's not just necessarily just to reducing the number of refugees and asylum seekers. I think it's there's several things happening at the same time. That could be one element, and not just for the EU, but other countries as well. But secondly, in terms of looking specifically at development humanitarian sectors, diaspora is seen as a financial resource. I think there's that element. Also, potential volunteers and source of information. So I think there is multiple interests on that. So I'm with you on that, and I think it's we might see more of this topic. So Jeff, I think if we can have a different discussion on that, that would be great. In terms of I think there was a question, sorry, I'm just going through them quickly. Yeah, diasporas can also be political, can be political actors. There's no escaping of that. And, you know, Ethiopia, Eritrea is a good example of that. But I would also go to other examples. Northern Ireland. You had American, Irish diasporas who played an important role in supporting the IRA, but also in ensuring that Good Friday Agreement was signed. So I think we need to look a bit more cohesively, not in just in the global south, but also in the global north, what has been the role of diasporas on that. So diasporas, like political, like governments, like NGOs, all of that, different interests. And this is why the concept of context is so critical. And this is why this kind of research is done. This is why we've done this research project with the European Union Global Diaspora Facility. That's why we continue. We need to continue building the evidence-based, because diaspora's engagement is not static. Situation changes. Look, more than 2 years ago, no one knew we're going to be hit by a pandemic globally. But we had to also react, and everyone had to kind of act to that. So it really changed the environment and the spaces. So context is crucial. I think it's not about trapping about policy, Anja, but in terms of the questions, I think it's not about dangerous for refugees. And I think we just need to contextualize all context, and I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Benjamin, I see your hands raised.
Yeah, also again on one of the 2 points that were made in the chat, in the questions, I think with the terms, I increasingly use the term translocal networks, but because it's a bit more free from this sort of nationalist territorial bias, right, that we have. So we also need to look at like internal displacement situations and the mobilities within the respective countries and the relations that are there and that exist over distance within respective countries. And for instance, our research in the Congo showed, that there are, mutual relations, from the communes where people originally came from to the city where they now live, and sort of both who continue now have been displaced to the city, they can benefit from their relations to the rural communes where they come, as well as the rural communities. They can benefit from resources, knowledge, skills transfer, and all of that. So I think sort of why for simplicity, it makes sense to stay sometimes in the national frame of thinking. Also, I think sometimes it helps to move beyond it and just look at like people's connections, across places that are complicated by borders and the states and all the regimes that they put into place. Then a second more general comment, again, that I've got before, I think sort of in terms of providing support across the distance and through networks, we need to distinguish different groups, and the different way how they're embedded in networks. We have people who are very much embedded in local transnational networks, who have many sources of support, and who can benefit from this. But on the other sides is also we have people who are left out from network support, who are, outside the frame of family, who do not have access to local sources or transnational remittances and so forth. So that when we need to acknowledge sort of the potential of networks in supporting people, we always need to remind ourselves, of course, that there are people left out of supporting networks, and sort of interventions and that are made also need somehow also I think to balance that out a little bit.
Thank you. Anila, you had your hand raised as well?
Yes, so no, I agree with all panelists. The definition is so difficult, but I will share my own realization point of, which is linked with how you define yourself. When I born and raised up in Pakistan, I never realized I'm a daughter of a refugee who migrated to Pakistan from Indo-Pak Kashmir. So I never realized that my father was also a forced migrant or refugees. But as my situation changed, my migration, situation changed, then I realized, okay, I'm now in this category. So realizing like how I define myself, how migrant and refugees or diaspora define themselves, I think this is an important point. And I will point this realization of acknowledgement to the Jeff question as well, like how we the interest of EU in the diaspora, because I also wearing the hat and part of a European Commission advisory board where we are representing migrant and diaspora interest to European Commission, and there it shows they have huge interest. But I totally agree with Fanny. We do not have Aladdin's lamp. We don't have magic to solve all the solution. This expectation from the diaspora community that they work voluntarily, free, and to bring all the solution, it's not helping anyone. So this is a huge expectation from diaspora. There's interest, and because this interest shows the importance to engage migrant and refugees in the discussion, that's the interest shows. But again, it's need more resourceful, it's need to be more meaningful, and how we can create this realization of how diaspora communities been involved on a very limited level, or they are not getting more resources, they are not getting doors, they are just getting little bit holes and little bit windows to intervene. they're not getting fully access, and how we can create these synergies, collaboration more important when we are talking about especially the relationship of EU and the diaspora engagement. That is very important.
Thank you. So I think if all of our panelists are able, or for those who are able to stay, I would propose just extending by a few minutes to get to a couple more questions. Perfect. Thank you for your flexibility. So just two practice related questions here. The first is about COVID-19, which of course has come up a few times already. Are there examples of ways that diaspora communities, transnational networks have shifted their partnerships or engagement online during COVID as a result of constraints on mobility? And the second question talks about the importance of working locally versus scaling, both of which have been mentioned as important factors. And this person asks, why should I scale up or institutionalize a refugee-led initiative if sometimes small is better? It'd be great to hear your thoughts, whoever wants to start first. Perfect, Bashair.
Hi, no, I think good questions. In terms of the first one, the second question, actually, I'll start with. Sometimes bigger is not better. And I think sometimes this is where you can see some of the pressure, and I think it's a challenge, this pressure for all diaspora organization or migrant organization to professionalize, to emulate, the development humanitarian sector structures and all of that. So, and this is where they lose a really important, the agility, the speed and all of that. So I think recognizing that sometimes that diversity is so important to kind of maintain and support it. So if they want to remain small and all of that, I think, yes, I think work with that. Sorry, what was the second question?
The other one was talking about online engagement during COVID-19.
Yes, there has been quite a few examples of that, and we've seen this in our work. Increasingly, what we saw right at the beginning of the start, at the start of the pandemic, when the epicenter was in Europe, we saw, for example, Sudanese doctors. We have Sudanese Doctors Union, and they were telling colleagues in Sudan about some of the challenges, the issues with COVID, because at the time there was not a lot of knowns. So they returned to kind of, they were organizing workshops, telemedicine kind of formats to try to share that knowledge with their colleagues, because they couldn't travel because of the borders were closed. So you couldn't, someone couldn't from UK travel to Sudan because the borders were closed at the time. So online became quite an important medium, also to encourage, vaccine, because there's a bit of vaccine hesitancy among certain communities. So trying to address that. So there was a lot of examples where technology has played a critical role in terms of the COVID-19 response. There's numerous examples of that, and probably we might not have the space to discuss it more, but I'm more than happy to post in the chat some other examples of that.
Great, thank you. Fanny, yes, on to you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, fully agree with Bashair. I mean, in our work, we also really saw a surge in online activities, and the diaspora organization that really shifted their work online. So there are now several examples of skills transfer schemes that are doing digitally. Actually, our own work within EUDIF, because we also provide capacity development services to governments and to diaspora organizations, and we had to adapt and to also provide these services online. So we also provide this capacity development activities now through Zoom or through other modes. So I think that the whole diaspora ecosystem, I think, has actually adapted quite quickly to the need to move into something more digital. Maybe just, the second point was on is institutionalization always needed? And I think, no, I agree actually with Bashair. It is not something that all diaspora organizations should strive for. I think that for the ones that want to, support should be provided. But what I mentioned before is really the need to acknowledge all the different segments and types of diaspora groups. Not all of them are going to become well settled NGOs, and I think it's fine because they also provide other services and other skills, and they also have different types of links with their countries of origin that I think are just as important than more established and professionalized organizations. So I think yeah, it's good to keep this diversity.
Great, thank you. Anila?
Yes, I will answer this question with my gender feminist lens, because if you know, there are so many countries or different kind of culture who do not allow a woman to use their names, their pictures on social media. And in this scenario, if we are talking about the women who are living in the camps, in either they are urban or remote camps, they are so much limited access to the internet. They do not have mobiles, they do not have laptop. We need to realize that we can't expect all the diaspora or migrant or refugee-led initiative who has the ability to use these resources. And these resources, this digitalization has itself one kind of a new element within, with the power and the poverty, both. So we need to realize that, and that's why reason when we are advocating for vaccine for all for vaccine, we use all the available resources which we had. We use translation, we use WhatsApp groups, we use Zoom, we use Skype, and even individual capacities to engage different languages when we are talking about the information. But the thing is that we realize we can't keep them isolation, because internet is one kind of a main component of our life right now, and it will become bigger than we can imagine. It is gonna be huge. People do not have the access or digitalization. So just I will share, like in Netherlands, because I live in Netherlands, we use very easily PIN card, the bank card. But in Germany, when I'm living nowadays, there mostly people use cash. So this new learning, how these different contexts even force you to become more impactful, resourceful, of meaningful, but how same component, if with the different resources, can become useless and you are not resourceful, and how these technologies are helping and these becoming more barriers to the communities who are trying to engage, like in our recent engagement where we are trying to engage different refugee leaders from MENA region, from Africa region and Latin America, and their vaccine was not recognized in Europe and they couldn't even get the visas. So these all are linked with each other. How digitalization, how do new recognition and knowledge and laws and policies connected with each other, we can't talk about more safety of the future of world right now where we are stuck in this pandemic.
Thank you. Benjamin, did you wish to add anything?
No, I think the ladies here have been the experts on the last two questions, so perfectly happy with it.
Okay, great. Well, that's, I guess we're already over time anyway, so I'll simply say thank you to all of our speakers very much for being here with us today for this conversation, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining. I'd like to take the opportunity to quickly just invite you to our next webinar in the series, The Governance of Exit Regimes and Sustainable Reintegration Post-Exit, which will be held next Tuesday, the 25th of January, and hosted by the AdnaGov project. So stay tuned, and that's all for today. Thank you so much, and take care.